We believe and have always believed in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you? Well, hello, everyone. I'm Doug DeVos, and welcome to another episode of Believe. And this is a special one because I have my sister-in-law, Betsy DeVos, who's joining us here today. Betsy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a thrill to be here, Doug.
Great.
Really glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about something that's vitally important. And as many of you know, Betsy served as a U.S. Secretary of Education recently, and we couldn't be more proud of you and what you did, what you accomplished, and the challenges that you faced in that process. But it was a somewhat unexpected opportunity that came your way.
It certainly was. It was not anything I'd ever gotten up in the morning and thought about prior to that day in 2016. But it did go back to, more than 35 years of really working on behalf of kids around policies that were going to give families the opportunity to find the right fit, the right educational setting for their kids. And it went back to when Rick, our oldest son, was going into kindergarten, and we had the opportunity to choose the school that he was going to go to. We could do that as you and Maria could because we could afford to make those decisions. And the more I got into it, the more I realized there were so many families that wanted to make those kinds of choices and decisions for their kids, but couldn't because the system and the policies really have precluded it.
Right. And that really kind of gets to one of the central questions that we talk about is, why can't parents pick their own schools? Why can't choice be there? We think about it as Americans being free to choose our own destiny, the idea of the American dream, but yet this seems to be an area that's incredibly restricted. And there's a lot of history to this of how it came about. Help us understand how we got to this point and get ourselves framed in where things really stand.
So we've been operating under essentially the same model for about 175 years. Wow. And it was a model that was started in an age where we had a growing industrial economy, where we needed people to go to work making assembly line production items. And it was intended to bring disparate people together under a common framework, a common set of understandings, and a common knowledge framework. But it's today the least disrupted industry in our country. And some people bristle at the thought of education being an industry, but it truly is an industry, right, in every sense of the word. And it's, I would argue, the most important industry that our country has because it's preparing our future. And it's not doing the job for millions and millions of kids today who are really stuck in a framework that is antiquated, that is a one-size-fits-all system and approach. And we've been finding out just how antiquated it is in the last 2 years. Sure.
Well, that's why don't you talk about that a little bit? Well, there's a couple other questions I wanted to go back. You had so much right there that you just started, and we can, luckily in these formats, we have the time to kind of dive a little bit deeper. But start with where you just finished. Help us understand what happened in the past 2 years with COVID. How did this topic becomes so much more visible? What were parents seeing?
So I think for many families in the country, the lockdowns and all of the mandates around the COVID pandemic really opened their eyes to a system that has been existing more to serve adults and adult issues and adult needs than it has been focused on students. And we saw this with the interminable lockdowns and the closing out of schools in particularly large urban areas, and frankly in many statewide closures across the country, and then seeing how poorly the system responded to that challenge in many cases, where a kid might only have 1 hour of a distance learning, a Zoom kind of class a week, or a handful of hours, and so the learning loss is just incredible in this last 2 years, and then seeing also many parents for the first time up close what their kids are or aren't learning, and being really dismayed by what they're not learning, and in other cases being very dismayed by what they are being taught. And so you have a whole confluence of issues and experiences that have come to a head after these last 2 years that have awakened parents in a way that they hadn't been before. And it's really exciting to see the momentum around parents taking back the ability to control their kids' education in a way that they had not been attuned to before COVID.
Sure. So a lot of visibility. You think when you send your kids to school, they're in an environment that we may remember from our generation or that you think may be there, and then when you have a glimpse into it, you find out it's completely different.
Well, and if anybody was looking even before the pandemic, we would realize that, for example, the Department of Education was stood up in 1979. It was a payoff to the teachers union that Jimmy Carter gave after getting their endorsement for president in 1976. Okay. And so he followed through on his promise, established the Department of Education with the express purpose of closing the achievement gap between those at the highest end of the performance scale and those at the bottom end. In that time since then, in over 40 years, we have spent well over $1 trillion at the federal level alone to close that achievement gap. Not only has it not closed or narrowed one little bit, in many cases and in many measures, it's actually widened. And so the question has to be, why would we continue doing more of the same thing and spending more and more money, putting it after the same system, the same framework, and expect different results? My argument is we have to totally change the system and really empower families to make the choices and make the decisions about where their kids go to learn.
Right. And again, okay, a lot to go in. So I'm going to go back a little bit. First of all, start with before your role as secretary. You have, as you've met, 35 years, you've been passionate about this. You talked about your family situation, what you were dealing with, but you did a lot of work in other organizations on this issue before your role as secretary. Help our audience understand that a little bit so we can get a really good context of what you have experienced and seen in all of that time.
Sure. So one of the schools that I discovered when looking for a school for Rick and when starting kindergarten was a very small urban Christian school in Grand Rapids called the Potter's House. I got involved as a volunteer as a result there. And again, quickly realized that for every family that had their children there were probably 10 or 20 other families from the neighborhood who would have loved that kind of setting, that kind of environment or experience for their kids. So volunteering, we started supporting those opportunities through scholarships. Then Dick and I started a statewide scholarship organization with the goal of exposing more policymakers to this notion that families want to have more choices. And it became increasingly clear that simply making the case either logically or emotionally was not going to change policy. Ultimately, we had to get involved. I had to get involved and got involved politically in actually changing policy because the system has been reinforced year after year after year by those who benefit from the adult part of the system. They are very formidable. And it's headed right at the top by the teachers unions. And then it's all their allied organizations that really protect the system as we know it today. It requires politics to change that system. And so I started working in state organizations that did that work to take on the political pieces of it, and then expanded to national organizations. And as you know, by the time I went to Washington, was really working in a variety of states with one of the organizations that I chaired in making a difference on a state-by-state basis around the policies, but headed by, at the tip of the spear, being the politics and the really necessary head-to-head to really fight the status quo that has resisted change at every step of the way.
Right. And let's go back and touch on connect a couple dots. So we're talking about resistance to change, and you talked earlier about education being an industry and how people may bristle to that. But you also threw out a number just with federal spending since 1979 of $1 trillion. And I'm always mindful of the old example that Dad used to give of what's a billion. If you put $1 down every second, it takes you 32 years to get to $1 billion. And so to get to $1 trillion would take you 32,000 years. So just the magnitude of that number, it's easy to throw around, but the magnitude of that number, it's an industry, isn't it?
It's a huge industry, and we've seen it really exist to serve itself, particularly these last 2 years. And what has been done to kids, particularly the most vulnerable kids across our country in this last 2 years, is just unconscionable. We won't know for years yet be able to measure even close to accurately what the long-term effects have been of these 2 years of lockdowns, of 2 years of lost learning, and what this has done to kids. You know, we saw after just a few weeks of closure in the spring of 2020 how awful this was going to be for kids, particularly those in the most vulnerable of circumstances, low-income families who didn't have other options that some of the more well-to-do families did to be able to pull their kids out of a school that wasn't responding, or to hire teachers to tutor their kids, or whatever solution some families found. There were way more families that weren't able to find those solutions, and their kids have suffered as a result. Then you add to that what they have seen being taught to their kids, or lack of teaching the fundamentals. Because you look at the results, what our kids have been learning, and we are way behind our international counterparts. We're not even in the top 20 as compared to our international peers on how our kids do educationally, achieve their achievement educationally. And so even before we went into the pandemic, we were in a world of hurt. The kids that are coming up to lead our nation in the future. And this has only been magnified in the last 2 years.
Yeah, amazing. And if we keep you're in business, you understand that. And so many parents are. If you keep doing the same thing and get a bad result, in business, you go out of business.
That's
but
right.
This industry, how can it continue to go when it's not delivering the results? If we're not even in the top 20 globally, if we're not preparing these future generations, help us understand, how does the industry keep going?
Well, it has insinuated itself very deeply into one party, one of our two primary political parties. And, 99% of their contributions go to Democrats. And they, and so it's politicians who ultimately perpetuate the system. We keep electing people who look to the teachers' unions and all of their allies for the funding to get reelected. And it's a vicious cycle, but it is an egregious example of a quid pro quo. Right. So one party does the bidding of this interest group, this huge interest group, this huge status quo, and it's totally at the expense of our kids and frankly, our nation's future.
Sure. A couple things to elaborate on, and one, and I'd love your perspective on this. When we've connected with schools from time to time, Maria and I here in Grand Rapids or other places, you find some amazing people who are trying to do their best, and teachers, administrators whose hearts are in the right place. but it's hard to buck against the system. And you came in, and the Wall Street Journal recognized you as putting children and parents at the center of your agenda. And there's a lot of people in the space, in this industry, if you will, who do, but there's got to be a barrier there. Help us understand the barrier. Is it just the unions? Is it in that structure that's just too powerful for people to overcome, or reformers to overcome?
Well, it is this. It's a systemic thing. So there are many, many great teachers that are part of a system over which they have little to no influence themselves personally. And interestingly, I had a couple of roundtable discussions while secretary. I wanted to know, there were countless teachers who had been teachers of the year in their state or their district that had done their victory lap for the year and then gone back to their schools, and within a few months or a year or two of going back, quit teaching. And I wanted to understand why. I mean, clearly these were good teachers.
Sure.
They'd been recognized and feted as such. And so I sat down and just listened to them talk. And what I heard on balance was this. We had our moment, and we went back with the hopes that we were going to have an opportunity to help our fellow teachers, maybe less experienced ones, younger ones, newer ones, to become better at what they do.
Right.
But instead, we were told to get back in our box. You've had your moment, and now you go back and just do your thing according to our system and according to our plan and schedule. And, more than one of them said, I got tired of it. Why would I keep doing this without having any opportunity to advance myself? And so it really has been a system that is not set up for really great, outstanding educators to have a career path opportunity. Most of them who are really good get brought into administration,
Right.
which might not be their strong suit.
Sure.
And then they're not in the classroom, which is their strong suit. And so it is a system that really is almost self-defeating, and it has really discouraged so many good people away from it, never entering it in the first place, or many who've been in who've just gotten so discouraged and so frustrated. And so I really give credit and great tribute to those who have hung in there and stuck with it. But it's time for them to be freed in a new way also. And that's why I believe that a system that is truly oriented around education freedom, where the funds for every student follow that child to the school or education setting of their parents and their family's choice, will ultimately be freeing for everyone involved. Everyone who is great in their role as a teacher or administrator or any other piece of the system today will have much greater opportunity in an environment of education freedom. We will have creation of new kinds of K-12 experiences we haven't even begun to dream of, because we will have creative people with the freedom to create, able to do so, and families able to take advantage of that.
Sure. And just to kind of close the industry, discussion, it doesn't seem like there's any market forces at play currently. And what you're talking about is putting some market forces in play. That's what guides our whole economy. Is the result of first of all knowing who the customer is, the child, the parent, and understanding the role of teachers and administrators, like we said, many of whom are unbelievably great folks who are really trying to do the best. But if the industry is spitting out, if you will, or frustrating its best and its brightest, That's a
Exactly.
tough spot to be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you have a system that basically has everyone move lockstep with one another, whether you're really outstanding at what you do or whether you're below average, how long is anyone who's truly outstanding going to really want to continue to be a part of that? And we see that across the board when it comes to the experience in K-12, the K-12 system is that there's just very little opportunity for really great educators and administrators, and there's no opportunity for those who don't have the means to choose something different.
Right. So let's kind of focus on the choice again, but maybe in different aspect, not just of the school that they go to, but parental involvement in what the school is doing. And lots of discussion today about different programs being taught, whether it was Florida with sex education or other sorts of topics that are being taught into the school that parents now seem to, through this COVID experience, are starting to see that in a new way and go, wait a minute, how are these decisions made? And what's the role of my school versus the role that I want to play as a parent? Help us understand maybe how curriculum gets developed, how somebody decides it's a good idea, and how it gets implemented, and then how the parents are kind of left out of the discussion.
Yeah. Well, this is not a new phenomenon.
Okay.
But what is new is the fact that families across the country have seen now firsthand what's going on in their kids' schools, and many of them are not happy with what they're seeing, whether it's the lack of academic rigor. And, we've seen example after example of states and communities that have continued to, in the interest of equity, have continued to lower the bar and expectations as though that's somehow going to improve the situation for any student. And the opposite is true. And so families are upset about that. Families are upset about curriculum that invades their space of purview, whether it's teaching kindergartners about sexually charged topics that are totally inappropriate for children of that age, or even multiple years older. And so this is again awakened parents in a way that we haven't seen before, and we've seen a lot of engagement at school board meetings, getting involved in school board races, talking about having their money follow their child to choose a different setting. We've seen the numbers of homeschooling families double across the country, and that's only what's reported. And among Black families, interestingly, increase fivefold. And so there's a trend, or there's a momentum around a different approach to K-12 education. And, policymakers better pay attention, and they better embrace this notion that parents need to be the ones who are driving this bus, not the system, because parents didn't sign up to co-parent with the government.
Right. Well, exactly right. Parenting's hard enough. to have the government into it would just make it more difficult. Let's keep on that track a little bit of you connected the dots earlier that you said you had a personal situation. As you dove into it, you saw it as more than just emotion or logic. You had to get involved politically, and you're seeing that happen more and more, and that is becoming a priority. Are political leaders seeing it around the country? Are they seeing it? Are they sensing it? Give us an understanding of this sense. We may see just a piece of the elephant. We may not know what's happening in a different state, or the momentum that you're talking about. Help us get a glimpse into how that's being portrayed, where the power, all the power from government comes from the people, at least in our system. So this would seem to connect in that sense as well.
So one of the most recent and best examples to date, or recently, has been the Virginia governor's race this fall, where Glenn Youngkin, dramatic underdog and in a blue state, won as a Republican because he sided with parents and with students and said, we need to be listening to parents. We need to be putting students in the center of the equation. And his opponent, Terry McAuliffe, who had been governor of Virginia before, seemed completely tone deaf on the issue. And as a matter of fact, at the last, the night before the election, brought in Randy Weingarten, head of the American Federation of Teachers, as his closing speaker. How much of a disconnect you could have, it was just astounding to me. So that's a really good example of harnessing that momentum, and a candidate who saw the moment and read the moment right and embraced it and it went with it. Another example was in 2018, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida won a squeaker of a governor's race there by about 50,000 votes. And when you dove into the numbers afterwards, you quickly found that Ron DeSantis, first of all, had championed the school choice education freedom programs in Florida and said he was not only going to protect them, but expand them as governor. His opponent, Andrew Gillum, said he wanted to wipe them out and do away with them. Well, when you went into the numbers, there were over 100,000 Black females that voted for Governor DeSantis. So at twice or more the percentage that you would have expected voting for a Republican that voted for him. And so that race and that example is a really important one for other candidates for office across the country. Pay attention to what families want, to what parents want. And today, this issue of putting parents in charge is a 75+% issue, no matter what way you look at it.
Wow. Great support. And to a certain extent, a validation of 35 years of your work of seeing this, and the pieces seem to be coming together, that action's really happening.
Yeah, well, nobody would have predicted that 2 years ago we would be where we are now with the discussion. But if there is a silver lining to the pandemic, it is this with regard to education, that we have an opportunity to really fundamentally change a kid's K-12 education experience and customize it for them.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's shift a little bit to higher ed. And I've had the chance to talk to a few university presidents and college presidents, and the topic comes up of pathways to prosperity, if you will. And we've had some great discussions with different people about how students find their way. But one of the topics that has come up has been at least the marketing, the promotion, that the only way to success or prosperity is through a 4-year college degree. And then I would ask then the cost of a 4-year college degree, or the value equation of a 4-year degree. Fabulous for many people, but maybe not for everybody. So the broadening of the marketing, if you will, of the role that education can play in somebody once they've graduated from high school, of where they can go, what the options are available. I know that as secretary, you studied and reviewed that, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. Help us understand those sorts of options and the potential ranges for people at that stage of their life.
Well, higher education, in my view, is anything that is beyond high school that you do to improve your opportunity for whatever you want your future to look like. And we have, for too long, culturally, societally, said that the only way to a successful adult life is to go and graduate from a 4-year college or university. The reality is that might have been the case, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But today, there are so many more opportunities. There are millions of jobs open today that don't require a 4-year degree. Right. And yet, again, we are continuing to message high schoolers that their only opportunity for success is to go to a 4-year college. So we have kids starting college, going for a year or two, not knowing what they want to do, what they want to pursue, taking on debt, and then dropping out and not having anything to show for it. A very, very bad situation. education, we're not giving kids good input and good exposure to these various opportunities while they're in high school. I remember another roundtable I had with high school guidance counselors, most of whom were totally in this mode of four-year college. That's what you need to do. That's what you need to plan for. And they had very, very little to no resource to help students find and get exposure to and consider other opportunities. This is one of the things that President Trump was very adamant about, was really expanding these pathways to higher or to beyond high school. Right. To encompass things like apprenticeships. And we worked very hard to get a new apprenticeship program established with the Department of Labor, ones that would be really created by industry where need exists, and be able to work together with like industries to put together specific apprenticeship programs and then offer these widely. Switzerland does this very well. 75% of their high school students are in some kind of an apprenticeship. And most people, when they hear the word apprenticeship, think of building trades. And in some cases, healthcare avenues or tracks. But in Switzerland, the CEO of UBS, one of the largest banks in the world, started as an apprentice in a bank. And the chairman of the board, the same thing. And so you think differently when you consider the broad expanse that apprenticeship earn and learn opportunities can encompass. And these are areas that I think any higher ed institution today should be serious about exploring. And I think the 2 years of the COVID pandemic is also going to shake out higher education in a way we had not seen or experienced before, because there were a lot of students who paid their full tuition and had a very poor experience. Sure. And are wondering today, is college worth it? And those are valid questions. One of the things we also did at the department was to add valuable information to what's called the college scorecard. And anyone can go to the college scorecard at the Department of Education site and go and look for and compare institutions. So if you're deciding I might want to go to Purdue University, but I want to compare— Great
illustration, by the way. Great illustration.
I figured that. But I wanted to compare it to IU, for example, a program there. It used to be you only could compare cost by institution and then average earnings by institution. Now you can go down to the program level. Oh, wow. So you can decide, is an engineering degree at Purdue, what's it going to cost me? And what am I likely to earn year 1, 2, 3? And that earnings data is added each year now. So it will be a longitudinal value as well. And I can compare that to other institutions. I can compare programs to different, varying programs. And so it will help, I believe, expose the, many of these degree programs that are not actually paying off for students in the long term. And I think that's going to help bring about some change as well. But the change has got to come from outside the system, and that's another thing that we worked on, was opening up the accreditation process so that different creative providers could get into the higher ed marketplace and offer new opportunities in new ways, shorter term programs, and all kinds of different approaches based on what the needs are. Sure. And again, millions of jobs that don't require a 4-year degree. And I think more and more students are awakening to that reality.
Yeah, yeah. And you speak, as you talk about that, you're speaking about the cost and then how people have financed that. And so that's a big issue today. So help us understand, why have costs in higher ed gone increased so much over the years, and then linked to it, student debt is a topic, and then the forgiveness of student debt is a topic today. And you're talking about, again, over $1 trillion, a huge amount of taxpayer investment. So what's going on in that? Help us unpack that. I think for all of us, we'd look at how does this happen?
So today there's about $1.7 trillion in student debt.
Holy smokes.
And just to give context to that, and I probably won't get the years exactly right here, but my recollection is the first 40 years of student lending, for higher education, the loan balance came to roughly $500 billion. The next 10 years after that, it went to $1 billion. So, $1 trillion. So $500 billion to $1 trillion in 10 years after, decades of accumulation before that to 500. And then just since 2010, it has gone to 1.7 trillion. First of all, the federal government federalized student lending in 2010. The argument was that the federal government could make lending cheaper to college students, and it could be used to finance Obamacare. Well, that has not panned out. Not only has that not panned out, it has been a disaster. And there's been no governor on the cost of attending a college, right? There's no limitation on what a college can charge for tuition. And they also don't have accountability on results.
Right.
So their students could, be earning a fraction of what they have spent in college tuition, and yet there's no real accountability for higher ed institutions for having charged that much to students. So the whole model is really wrong,
right,
and it needs to be really readdressed. One of the things we did while in office was a deep dive into the whole student loan portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
And it was judged that more than half of the existing portfolio was basically bad debt.
Wow.
And so when you hear this current president talk about forgiving student loans, and we've had now a 2-year pause on payment on student loans. I mean, just that pause has cost taxpayers $150 billion. And so this whole situation is a house of cards. And it was something that I raised very early on. I hope Congress gets serious about looking at this. And I hope, frankly, that the discussion about massive student loan forgiveness is simply talk. I don't think it's not legal it's I believe patently illegal based on our research.
Now. Can the president just go do this or not?
No, it is according to all of the legal work we did. It is not possible, and even President Obama's former general counsel at the Department of Ed has opined on this as well, saying he does not believe it is legal. But that's not even to mention the fact that this is not fair.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Taxpayers.
I was just going to say. So this is a cost benefit. How many people are paying and how many people are receiving?
So 2 out of 3 Americans have not taken out student debt, student loans.
Okay.
And so and then of the existing outstanding loans, if you're talking about massive debt forgiveness, the vast majority of these are high income earners that have taken out big loans for graduate degrees, most of them wealthy, white, and professional. And so it would be the biggest transfer of wealth from the poorest to the wealthiest of Americans if student loan debt was to be forgiven.
Wow. Wow. Well, that doesn't seem right.
No, it doesn't seem right at all. It's not right.
And that's just one of those things that goes down the track when you talk about some of these numbers and how this gets managed. It's just downright scary that some of these things can happen. And of course, I love how when the federal government really got involved, it got significantly worse really fast.
Exactly. I mean, it's probably the prime example of how government and why government should not be involved in private sector type of activity.
Yeah, great. Well, so we'll transition now. We got a few minutes left here. Transition now. You've spent 30 years in this space. You've served as a Secretary of Education, but you're not done. And in fact, right between us here, and I'll make sure I show it up, is a book that you have that will be coming out soon. And I want to give you a chance to talk about it. And I'm curious about how we turn some of these discussions, or how we turn, if you will, logic, emotion, and policy or political will, if you will, into action. But talk to us about your book. Help us understand, why did you write this? And why is this an important aspect of Betsy DeVos going forward?
Well, I never set out to write a book, but having concluded the experience as secretary and having had all of the experiences that I did and the insight into the workings of a federal agency,
which is pretty scary, as we've talked about.
Yes.
Yeah.
I felt it was important to take some of those experiences, some of those stories, and sort of record them and write my what my observations are. I visited hundreds of schools as secretary, K-12 schools and higher ed institutions, and I think and it was always with the intention of finding schools and places that were doing things differently to encourage creativity and encourage flexibility and nimbleness. And so I'm talking about some of those experiences. I'm talking about the policies that relate to those experiences, and then talking about what I see as the way forward for the future of primarily K-12 education. We touch on higher ed in a number of places, and that may be another book. Who knows? But
well, there you go. You're on a roll.
But taking that experience and really talking about how we need to change policy to actually upend what is an average kid's experience of their K-12 education, because the one size fits all, top down, on the cover you see this is a classroom that looks very much the same today as it did over 100 years ago. Not much has changed in that regard, and yet everything around us has changed in fundamental ways. And I think about, the kids who get bored to death by the time they're in 5th grade. That shouldn't happen. Learning should be exciting. Learning should be stimulating. Learning should be fun. And there's no reason it can't be. And there's no reason we can't have education experiences that help every kid find and discover their inner talents and everything that they have to offer the world, and do so in ways that are going to relate to them.
Yeah, great. Well, you've put it all down. Can you give us a couple stories out of there, a couple of those experiences and observations? We got to have one that just shows, boy, things are really wrong. And there's got to give us a story of something that you saw on those trips when you were out there and you saw some innovation, and give us something that's encouraging. Now, we want everybody to read the book when it comes out. It's called Hostages No More. And I want to talk about the title in a second, but maybe give us a little taste of a story or two in there.
So one that comes to mind as a negative experience, but really reaffirmed my goal of trying to make sure every child has the opportunity to access an education that works for him or her, was actually my second day or third day as secretary. I went to visit a school in Washington, D.C., and protesters had found out, the unions had found out I was going to visit. It was not publicized, but they had found out somehow, and they blocked my entrance into the school physically. I ultimately got in, and I ultimately had a great conversation with teachers, kids, parents. But it again affirmed to me and was a very evident example of to what extent the defenders of the status quo will go to try to preclude change. And, those kids deserve every opportunity, like every kid across the country. And so that was, I think, one of it sort of steeled my resolve to continue to fight for them and for all the kids that they represent. There were so many schools that I visited that were fun and interesting and unique, and were doing things differently. I think I would say one unexpected place that I visited and was really excited to find out about this particular district was Casper, Wyoming, which, it's a small school district, but they have, of their own volition, basically opened up the whole district of traditional public schools and made each of their schools sort of unique in and of itself. So one of them was a Spanish language immersion school. Another one, the one that I visited, was a elementary school that had no administration. The teachers were teachers and families were the administrators. They also didn't have the distinctions between the grades. So kids would be moving on in certain subject areas as fast as they could, and then taking longer time in the ones that they had to take more time in. But it was a great example of what can be when people work together and acknowledge that the student has to be at the center of things. So those were just two examples.
Right. And so the first one I remember, and being your brother-in-law, was incensed that you were at risk personally when you're trying to serve in this capacity, and that people can disagree in any way, but you got to let our elected officials and appointed officials do their jobs. So that's just a personal observation. I remember when that happened. But the second one, that's not necessarily a private versus public versus Christian. These are the schools, and in the state and in the community, they just decided to work together. Does that happens?
It was unique to that district. Wow. I don't know of any other district that approaches it that way. I'd be thrilled to hear about it and learn about it. But it was again an affirmation of what can happen when you're focused on doing the right thing for students, and then adults orienting around that.
Yeah. It can happen. Well, that's great. So talk about the book a little bit more. Hostages No More, coming out soon. And talk about it in the sense, other things that are important to you to pull out of it for us to know in our audience, but also maybe in the context of, okay, we've had this discussion. We've been talking about these issues. And what our audience, our listeners, what do we do? What do we do? How do we take action? How do we, define results in our community? How do we, reaffirm the power that we have in our communities to not just what I want to do, but to listen and share with other parents and kind of find a way forward if we put the children at the center of what we're trying to accomplish. Help us with that a little bit.
Well, most education policy is made at the state level. Now, the federal government has a tremendous overlay over that. I would argue it should not. It is the state's role to set education policy and to empower, I would argue, to empower the most local unit, which is the family. Mm-hmm. And so my urging would be that those who are interested and want to be part of the solution to help ensure that your state legislators and your governor are going to ultimately support policies that support dollars following and flowing after individual kids. It should be about kids, not about buildings or systems. It should be about funding those children individually, not about buildings or systems. I often use the metaphor of the backpack. So kids go to school every day with the stuff they need for the day. Metaphorically, we should be attaching the dollars that are already spent on that child for their family to decide how to best educate that child. So advocating for elected officials that are going to vote to support those policies, and raising voices about that in ways that are undeniable, like don't be apologetic for being on the side of families and kids. Embrace that and know that you're going to get pushback from people who are part of the system. But the reality is that in states where more freedom has been given to families, all kids' outcomes and experiences and opportunities have improved. And so that is at the core, I think, putting the student at the center of it and putting the family immediately around that student as the best advocate for that student is ultimately what we need to be doing, and the policy changes that can follow. And there's different methodologies and there's lots of different ways of achieving that. But if that is the core of what readers take away, figuring out how to be a constructive part of that in whatever state they live in, that'll be good.
That's the path forward. And am I just crazy? Well, I could be. You've known me a long time. I could just be crazy. But at pre-K, parents pick and then pay for what they do, and in higher ed, you pick and then pay for what you do. And if the government, if the society and our citizens all think that K to 12 makes all the sense in the world, you're not prescribing a solution. You're just giving them the option to develop or choose a solution. It just seems, on its face, it seems like it's consistent with everything, or with many other things we do in our society, not inconsistent. In fact, the inconsistency is trapping. Am I
No, that's absolutely right. And that actually is reference to the title, Hostages No More.
Okay.
So Horace Mann.
Good, because I wanted to ask you to talk about the title.
Yeah. So Horace Mann, the father of the modern education system, and I use modern in quotes because it's 175 years old. Right. Interestingly, Horace Mann died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell made his first telephone call. Wow. So, you put that in context. But Horace Mann said at the founding of the system, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but it was that basically parents are right to assume and know that educators are taking their children hostage to their cause of preparing them to be societal conformists, basically, the widget makers,
right, and
to fit into the industrial model that was developing at the time. So he acknowledged that they were taking children from their families hostage to the cause of this conformist approach to preparing the next generation. And I argue the children have now been taken hostage in ways far beyond that, and hostage to agendas that haven't been aligned with many, many families' agendas, and hostage to schools that have failed kids across the board and with no escape and no way out. So Hostages No More is the forward-looking title that we will achieve education freedom for kids in K-12 in our country.
There you go. So Betsy, as we wrap up here, the whole title here is Believe What We Believe. And you have lived your beliefs. You have for years and years. That's my experience ever since I've known you, that you have strong beliefs and you work hard to express them in positive and helpful ways to impact others. So maybe just a few final thoughts on for those who may be wondering about what they believe and where could they find more. Certainly, reading your book to learn more. But how would you suggest they, if there's further questions, how they help shape their beliefs and gain an understanding of what's going on?
Well, I'd encourage they read the book.
Okay.
And
I guess that was an easy one.
It's certainly not the be all and end all, but it does really help bring together, my journey on this. And, the foundation of the journey was that, I firmly believe every single child is uniquely created by God and has tremendous potential. And I feel burdened by the responsibility of helping to ensure that every child has the opportunity to fully develop. And so that has been my driving passion for all of these years. And we've had some successes and we have a long way to go. But there's a lot more people engaged and energized around this today, and I'm very encouraged by that. And I just hope that many, many more will get on the train and help make it happen for kids.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, thank you for having those deep beliefs. Thank you for sharing them, and thank you for your commitment to so many people, so that they can have choices and that they're not trapped in something that's not the right solution for them. Not to presume what is the right solution for them, but that they can have a choice and move forward. So, Betsy, thanks so much for
thanks, Doug,
sharing your
and
sharing
thanks
your
for
heart.
your continued great support and encouragement.
Well, I'm honored to be part of it. It's a tremendous honor to have had a glimpse into watching you. It's tough, so I'm glad I had a seat where I could watch without being in the middle of it, because you were in the middle of it, and that was exciting to watch because I was so proud of you, what you've done. But it was hard to watch because you took a lot of shots, and it's not an easy path to go.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Betsy, and thank you for joining. We'll wrap it up, this episode of Believe. And as you've heard, there is a question. Why can't parents pick their school that they find best for them? Well, maybe in the future they can. More and more for everyone. So, Betsy, thanks again for being with us. And we'll look forward to a next conversation on Believe very soon. Thanks, everybody.